Hello, this is part of my series of videos on science fair judging. Today I want to talk about how many repetitions are sufficient for science fair. And that's a difficult question which doesn't have a good answer. So let's talk a little bit about what things affect the number of repetitions. One obvious thing is variability. How much change do you expect to see from one measurement to the next? If there's a lot of variation, then you may need to make more measurements in order to get a good idea of what the underlying value actually is. If there's very little variation, for instance, measuring mass of a pieces of metal with a lab balance, you don't need to make the measurement over and over again because you're going to get the same answer every time. Related to that is the effect size. How big a change do you expect to see from the control condition versus the experimental condition? If this change is very small, particularly if it's small compared to the variability in the measurement, then you have to make a lot of measurements in order to be even able to detect the effect reliably. On the other hand, if the effect size is huge, then a very small number of measurements will be sufficient to get a pretty good idea of how big the effect is. So these two things go hand in hand. Behavioral studies often have a very high variability because people vary a lot, and the effect sizes are often quite small. So behavioral studies tend to need a lot of repetition, whereas some of the physics studies have very repeatable measurements and quite large effect sizes, and you may need only a few measurements just to confirm that the variability is as small as you expected it to be. Another thing that affects things, not just for science fair, but for measurements in real professional science, is the cost or difficulty of making the experiment. Expensive experiments can't be repeated as often as cheap experiments, and this is often the constraining factor in determining whether or not an experiment can be done. Is how much does it cost to do it? How difficult is it to do? For science fair, quite often the cost is not a monetary cost so much as it is a cost in terms of the amount of time it takes. Students do not have it's not their full-time job to be science fair students, and so spending a lot of time on doing repetitions is not always the best use of their time. So looking at the cost or difficulty of doing it, if something is trivial to repeat, then we're more likely to expect repetitions than if it's very difficult to repeat. And the last thing is the grade level. We have very different expectations of the youngest students and the oldest ones. And how much we expect depends on who they are. So at the youngest level, it's enough just for them to know that repeats are good and that doing some repetitions is a good thing, even if they don't quite understand why it is that repetition is a good thing. As they get into middle school, we expect them to be able to summarize their work, to be able to look at averages, and perhaps by the beginning of high school, we expect them to look at measures of variability, like standard deviation. Or if they're doing modeling, like linear fits, then we might expect them to look at the residues and the root mean square of the residues, which is the sort of the equivalent of standard deviation for doing model fitting. As we get up to the seniors in high school, and about to go to college, we start expecting to see things like statistical significance. And that's really what we expect to see at professional levels too. And the statistical tests that high school students use will generally be the simplest single hypothesis tests. We don't generally expect to see multiple hypothesis correction, though that's another thing that affects how much repetition is needed. So grade level is kind of the determining factor in saying, well, how many is enough? And one has to use one's judgment. This is not something where one can say, oh, they have to do 3 repeats or they have to do 50 repeats. It's a question of balancing. Do they understand why repetition is needed? Is the amount of repetition they use appropriate for the amount of variability and the effect size we're expecting? How much would it cost to do it? And just what is reasonable? And different judges will, of course, have different opinions about how much repetition is reasonable. So there isn't, unfortunately, a clear answer to how many is enough.